The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which felt wrong. Tuesdays were for ordinary things: the grocer's delivery, the mending, the quiet rhythm of a life that had shrunk itself down to fit inside 2 rented rooms in Edinburgh. Bad news, Miriam had always believed, should come on a Monday, when the whole week was already ruined anyway. She read it standing up, still in her coat, the door not yet closed behind her. Her uncle had filed the papers. Thornvale was gone. She sat down on the floor, not on the chair, not on the narrow settee with its worn armrest, on the floor, because the floor was the only thing that felt honest in that moment. Her father had been dead 14 months. 14 months, and Silas Marrow had waited just long enough for the grief to dull before he moved. She had known it was coming. She had not known it would feel like this. Like something reaching into her chest and simply removing a piece of her, cleanly, without ceremony, the way you'd take a stone from a wall. Miriam Voss had grown up at Thornvale. She knew which stair creaked and which window latch needed lifting before turning, and exactly where the kitchen garden caught the last light in October. She knew the smell of the library after rain. She knew the sound the old house made in February, a low groaning that her father had always said was the timbers settling, and her mother had always said was the house dreaming. Her uncle said she had forged the codicil. She had not forged anything, but it was his word against hers, and he had a solicitor and a seal and 20 years of careful cultivation among the right people in the right drawing rooms. And she had nothing except the truth, which, as she was learning, was surprisingly difficult to spend. The letter from the new owner arrived 3 weeks later. She almost didn't open it. She sat with it on the kitchen table for 2 days, turning it over in her hands at intervals, reading the return address the way one examines something that might be dangerous. The name on the seal was one she recognized without knowing why, the way you recognize a piece of music you haven't heard since childhood. Ashwick Holdings. Lord Ashwick. When she finally opened it, it was not what she expected. The estate required a housekeeper, the letter said. The position was immediate. Accommodation was provided. The previous housekeeper had left without notice. References would be appreciated but were not, in the current circumstances, strictly required. Miriam read it twice. Then she read it a third time, because she wanted to be certain she understood what she was considering. She was considering walking back into her own house as a servant. She told herself it was practical. She told herself she needed to see what Silas had done to the place, needed to find whatever evidence remained that her father had written that codicil himself, that the original will had been tampered with, that there was still something to be salvaged from the wreck of it. She told herself she was not doing this out of grief, or stubbornness, or the particular species of desperation that makes a person choose the worst possible option and call it a plan. She wrote back the same evening. She signed it M. Voss and mentioned nothing of Thornvale, nothing of her father, nothing of the 3 years she had spent managing that household before the lawyers and her uncle had arrived to take it apart. She was hired by return post. The coach from Edinburgh let her off at the bottom of the lane on a morning in late November when the frost had not yet lifted from the grass, and the sky was the particular gray of old pewter. She stood for a moment with her trunk beside her and looked up the rise toward the house. She had thought she was prepared for this. She was not prepared for this. Thornvale sat exactly as it always had. The stone facade, the east wing her grandfather had added, the yew hedges her mother had planted, and which had now grown considerably beyond what her mother had envisioned. It looked permanent. It looked, infuriatingly, like itself. It did not look like something that had been taken from her. It looked like it had simply been there all along, waiting, without any particular opinion about who was inside. She picked up her trunk and walked up the lane. The butler who admitted her was someone she didn't know, a stiff, careful man named Renton, who had apparently been brought from one of Ashwick's other properties, and who regarded her with the professionally neutral expression of someone who had learned not to form opinions about new colleagues until absolutely necessary. "His lordship is in London," Renton told her, showing her through the entrance hall. Her entrance hall, the one with the loose flagstone near the door that she'd been asking to have repaired for 3 years. "He visits the estate periodically. You'll have considerable independence in the management of the house." "I see," said Miriam. She was looking at the wall where her father's portrait had hung. There was a different painting there now, a landscape, competent, impersonal. The sort of thing chosen to fill a space rather than to mean something. She kept her face entirely still. "Any questions?" Renton asked. "Only the usual ones," she said. He showed her the housekeeper's room, her father's old study. She registered with a small private shock, that room converted now, and left her to settle in. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling, which was her ceiling, and breathed. She gave herself exactly 5 minutes. Then she stood up, unpacked her trunk with methodical efficiency, put on the gray dress that said housekeeper in every line of its cut, and went to learn what had been done to her house. The first 2 weeks were an education in restraint. She learned things about Thornvale that she had never known from the perspective of the family, which of the upstairs maids was competent, and which was sweet-natured but chronically distracted, that the cook, a compact woman named Mrs. Pellow, ran the kitchen with a calm ferocity and did not appreciate suggestions, that the boiler in the north wing had been temperamental since August, and that the previous housekeeper had been noting the problem in the maintenance ledger for some time without anyone taking action. She also learned what her uncle had taken. It was not, as she had half feared, obvious. Silas had not stripped the house the way you strip a carcass. He had been more surgical than that. Several pieces of furniture were gone from the drawing room, replaced with lesser things, but replaced, so that a casual eye would see a furnished room and not an absence. The silver in the dining room had been inventoried, and some of it was missing, but the inventory itself had been updated. The old records replaced with new ones that showed the current count as though it had always been correct. Her mother's writing desk was gone from the morning room. That one cost her something. She stood in the morning room for longer than was sensible, looking at the corner where the desk had been, thinking about all the letters that had been written at it, all the household accounts, all the small notes her mother used to leave for her father in a language of private reference that was entirely their own. Then she went back to work. She was in the library, taking inventory, running her fingers along the spines of books she had read and books she hadn't, noting what was missing and what remained when she heard the carriage. She looked out the window. The carriage was very fine, black, well-maintained, with a crest on the door that she recognized now as Ashwick's. It came up the drive at a pace that suggested someone who was entirely accustomed to arrivals being managed in his absence, who did not slow down for spectacle because he had never needed to. Miriam set down her inventory list. She had been expecting this in the abstract. She had not been expecting it today in the specific. She went downstairs. He was already in the entrance hall by the time she reached it, handing his coat to Renton with the efficient ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times in 1,000 houses. And he was. She had not anticipated this precisely, younger than she had constructed in her imagination. Somewhere in his mid-30s, perhaps, dark-haired. He carried himself with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned that a room will arrange itself around them if they simply wait. He turned when she came down the stairs. "Mrs. Voss," he said. It was not a question. He had clearly been informed. "Your Grace," she said, and something in her went very quiet and very careful, the way it does when you are doing something that requires absolute precision and you cannot afford to let your hands shake. She had been in this house her entire life. She was standing in her own entrance hall, and she had just addressed its new owner by his title, and she could not let a single thing show on her face. "Renton tells me the north boiler has been unresolved since August," Lord Ashwick said. "That is correct, Your Grace. I've documented the issue and have a list of the repairs required." "Good. I'd like to review it this evening." "Of course." He looked at her for a moment in the way of someone who is noticing something without yet knowing what it is. Then Renton appeared to show him upstairs, and he went, and Miriam stood very still in the entrance hall until she heard his footsteps reach the landing. Then she went to the kitchen, poured herself a cup of tea, sat down at the servants' table, and told herself, with great firmness, that she was fine. Lord Ashwick, she was careful, always, to keep that name in her mind and not to let herself think of him as simply the man who has my house. Stayed for 10 days. She learned, in that time, certain things about him that she had not expected to learn. He was not profligate. He inspected the accounts with genuine attention, asked questions that suggested he understood what he was looking at, and approved the boiler repair without complaint. He did not demand entertainment or company. He ate his meals without theater, and did not require the staff to perform a particular version of themselves in his presence. He was also, she noted with a kind of grudging interest, observant. "You know this house," he said to her on the 4th evening. She had brought the weekly household report to the study, her father's study. She had to keep reminding herself it was not, and he had been looking at it when he said it, not at her, which somehow made it worse. "I've been here for 2 weeks, Your Grace." 2 weeks isn't sufficient to know where the light comes from in the east corridor at 4 in the afternoon, he said, still looking at the report, or to know, without checking, that the 3rd linen press is the one with the sticky drawer. She kept her face perfectly still. "I'm thorough," she said. He looked up then. His eyes were gray, or perhaps green. It was difficult to determine in lamplight, and they had the quality of someone who has learned patience, not because it came naturally to him, but because he found it more useful than the alternative. "So I see," he said. She left as soon as it was polite to do so. That night she lay awake and thought about what she was doing. Not the practical details. Those she had thought through many times, but the deeper question of what she believed she would find, and what she would do with it when she found it. She had come back to look for evidence. She was increasingly certain the evidence existed. She had found 2 letters in the library already, tucked inside a volume of estate records, in her father's handwriting, referencing the codicil explicitly in a way that contradicted everything Silas had claimed. The letters were not, on their own, enough, but they were something. They were a thread. She needed more time. The trouble with Silas Merrow arrived, as trouble often does, without announcement. He appeared on a Thursday morning in December, coming up the drive in a hired coach. And Miriam, who was crossing the entrance hall when she heard the wheels, looked out the window and felt something cold move through her. She had not spoken to her uncle since the night she had been told to leave. She had not looked at his face. She had not trusted herself to. She was in the housekeeper's room before he reached the door. She told herself it was sensible. He wouldn't know her by name. She had been using her mother's maiden name, Voss, and Silas had never paid much attention to her mother's family. But her face was another question. She needn't have worried, as it turned out. Silas Merrow had not come to see the housekeeper. He had come to see Lord Ashwick. She found out what was said between them only gradually, in pieces, the way household gossip always travels. A word from the footman who had served the tea, a fragment from Mrs. Pellow who had been consulted about luncheon, a general atmosphere in the servants' hall of cautious unease. What she understood eventually was this: Silas wanted to buy Thornvale back. He had, apparently, discovered something. She didn't yet know what, about the original sale that he believed gave him grounds to renegotiate the terms. He had come to present this belief to Lord Ashwick in person, and Lord Ashwick had, from all accounts, listened with perfect courtesy and told him he would consider the matter. Miriam sat with this for 2 days. On the third day, she made a decision. She went to the study after the household had retired, knocked, and waited. "Come in," he said. She entered and closed the door and stood in the middle of the room, with her hands clasped in front of her. Not because she was nervous, she told herself, but because it helped to have something to do with them, and said, "I owe you an explanation, Your Grace." He looked up from the papers on the desk. "Do you?" he said. It was not a question either. "My name is Miriam Ashvale," she said. "Not Voss. Voss was my mother's maiden name. My father was Edward Ashvale, and this was his house for 31 years, and I grew up in it. Silas Merrow is my mother's brother, and he presented forged documents after my father's death to claim the estate. I came back as housekeeper because I believed there was evidence remaining that would prove the fraud." She stopped. The clock on the mantelpiece. Her father's clock, she noted, one of the things Silas had apparently not taken, ticked into the silence. "Have you found it?" Lord Ashwick said. She blinked. Of all the things she had prepared herself for him to say, that was not one of them. "Some of it," she said. 2 letters. There may be more in the estate records." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Ashvale." She sat. "Merrow's claim," he said, "is that the original solicitor who managed the sale made an error in the title search. He believes he can use this to void the sale or force a reduced repurchase price." He paused. "He is not wrong that there was an error. The solicitor's firm contacted me last month." "I see," she said. "What I find more interesting," he continued, "is that Merrow was aware of this error before he came to me. He was told about it, I believe, quite some time ago. He chose to wait until he had determined how large a claim he could make before approaching me." He looked at her steadily. "That is a particular kind of calculation." "He's very good at calculation," she said. "He calculated that a young woman without legal standing and without money would not be able to challenge him. He was very nearly correct." "Very nearly," he repeated. She could not read his expression. She was not sure she was meant to. "I would like," he said, "to see those letters." What followed was not simple. It was not quick. It was not, at any point, the sort of thing she would have called pleasant. The solicitor Lord Ashwick retained, a thorough, quietly tenacious man named Drummond, whom she liked immediately, spent 3 weeks in the library with her, going through the estate records. Her uncle hired lawyers. There were letters and counter-letters. There were 2 very unpleasant afternoons in Edinburgh that she would have preferred not to remember. But the letters were good evidence. The estate records, once examined properly, were better. There was also, it turned out, a second codicil, the original one, in her father's hand, witnessed by the family doctor, and a solicitor who had since retired to Inverness, and who, when contacted, confirmed everything. Silas Merrow, presented with this accumulation, did what men like her uncle typically do when cornered. He threatened. He suggested that Miriam's mental state was unbalanced by grief, that she had fabricated the evidence, that Lord Ashwick was being manipulated by a young woman with no credibility and an obvious motive. He said these things with great confidence and in formal correspondence, and in one memorable meeting in a solicitor's office in which he looked directly at Miriam and said, "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "I grew up with you," she said. "I think I know exactly what I'm dealing with." Drummond put a hand briefly on the table between them, a small gesture of warning, but she thought she saw the corner of his mouth move. Her uncle left. She did not see Lord Ashwick during most of this. He was in London for much of it, managing his own affairs, communicating through letters and through Drummond. and the house continued to run in the particular rhythm it had found under her management, which was, she noticed, with a private satisfaction she allowed herself in small doses, quite a good rhythm. She thought about him more than was sensible. She told herself this was because his choices were directly relevant to her situation, which was true. She told herself she was thinking about him in a practical sense, which was less true. She found herself, on several occasions, wondering what he had meant by certain things he had said in the study that evening. The careful way he had listened, the fact that he had asked about the evidence before he had asked about anything else, the particular quality of his stillness when she had said this was his house for 31 years. He arrived again in late January. The house had been his for 4 months by then, and it had also been, in some other sense that she was still working out the grammar of, entirely hers. She had put things back where they belonged when she'd found them in the wrong places. She had ordered the loose flagstone repaired. She had retrieved her mother's writing desk from a storage room in the east wing, where Silas had apparently left it, and she had put it back in the morning room, and she had not entirely thought through what she was going to say about that when the time came. The time came on the second morning. He walked into the morning room and stopped, and she was there already, sitting at the desk going through the linen inventory, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. "My mother's," she said. He looked at the desk, then at her. "I see," he said, and there was something in his voice that she could not name precisely, not censure, not surprise, something that sat closer to recognition. He came into the room and stood by the window the way he sometimes did when he was thinking something through. She had learned this about him, that he thought better on his feet and near light, and looked out at the kitchen garden which her mother had designed and which was bare now in January, but would be, she knew, remarkable in May. "Drummond writes that the case is settled," he said. "Yes, Merrow has withdrawn the claim." "Yes, which means," he said, turning from the window, "that the question of the original estate becomes considerably more complex." She put down the linen inventory. "I know. The honest legal position was this. Her father's will, properly probated, left Thornvale to her. The sale to Lord Ashwick had been conducted by her uncle while that will was being contested, using documents later proven to be fraudulent. Whether the sale itself was valid was a question that Drummond had said, with the careful equivocation of someone who genuinely didn't know, could go either way. What it meant, in practical terms, was that this was still, possibly, legally hers, and also, practically, his, and that those two things needed to resolve themselves into one thing, and she was not certain how. "I have a proposal," Lord Ashwick said. She looked at him. "I would like," he said, with the same careful precision he brought to everything, "for you to remain at Thornvale, not as housekeeper." She waited. "The estate is, in most meaningful senses, yours," he said. "You know it. You've managed it for the past 4 months more competently than anyone has managed it since, I suspect, your father. I have 4 other properties and a seat in the Lords, and considerably more I should be attending to than a Scottish estate that was brought to my attention. I'll tell you now. Specifically, because Merrow was trying to sell it under terms that were considerably below its worth, which I found suspicious, and which I am now in a position to understand was because he wanted it liquidated before anyone looked too closely." He paused. "I should have looked more closely at the time." "You didn't know," she said. "I should have." He said it simply, without drama. "I've thought about that." She had not expected that. She had expected many things from this conversation, and that had not been among them. "What I am proposing," he said, "is a legal arrangement that returns management of the estate to you, with the title held jointly until such time as—" He stopped. He looked at her in the way she had noticed him look at things he was deciding how to say. "Until such time as a more permanent arrangement presents itself." She was very still. "That is a very careful way of saying something," she said. "I am aware of that. What is the less careful version?" He was quiet for a moment. Salthouse outside, the January wind moved through the yew hedges her mother had planted, and the house made the low sound it made in winter, the settling and the dreaming. "I find," he said, "that I think about this house more than is strictly accounted for by the legal situation. And I find—" He stopped again, and she saw something cross his face that she did not think was calculated, something that arrived without his permission. "I find that the house is considerably less interesting to me without the person who knows which stair creaks." She looked at him. He looked back. "That is still quite careful," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm practicing." She thought about her father's clock on the mantel. She thought about the letters in her father's handwriting, the ones that had started all of this. She thought about January becoming May, and the kitchen garden her mother had designed, and the particular sound the house made when it was dreaming. She thought about the fact that she was sitting at her mother's desk, in the morning room of her own house, with a man who had bought it and was now, carefully, trying to give it back to her in a form she hadn't anticipated and couldn't entirely argue with. "I think," she said, "you should tell me your name." He blinked. It was, she thought, the first time she'd surprised him. "You know my name," he said. "I know your title." "That's not the same thing." Another pause. The clock ticked. "Edmund," he said. She had not expected that either. Not the name. It was a sensible name, an ordinary name, but the way he said it, with the slight carefulness of someone handing over something that matters. "Edmund," she said, trying it. "Miriam," he said back. And outside, the wind moved through the yew hedges, and the house made its sound, and Thornvale settled around them, both like something that had been waiting, without any particular impatience, for exactly this.